know what's fascinating? When we think about ancient Egypt, we picture those magnificent pyramids, golden treasures, powerful pharaohs. But have you ever wondered what life was really like for the women who lived in those shadows? Tonight, I want to tell you a story that the history books often gloss over. A story about half the population of one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. Women whose lives were far more complex, far more restricted, and honestly, far more tragic than we usually imagine. So, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, and let me take you on a journey along the Nile, back to a time when beauty could be both a weapon and a prison, when marriage was politics, and when freedom, well, freedom was something most women would never truly know. This is a story that needs to be told, a story that's been waiting in the shadows for thousands of years. Picture this. The sun rises over the Nile, casting that beautiful golden light across the water. The pyramids stand majestically in the distance. It's breathtaking, really. But if you were a woman in ancient Egypt, that sunrise meant something very different. It meant another day of work that never ended, another day of limited choices, another day of being, well, let's just say being something less than fully human in the eyes of society. See, here's the thing about ancient Egypt that nobody really talks about. Yes, they had female pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra. Yes, women could technically own property. And yes, compared to some other ancient civilizations, Egyptian women had certain rights. But, let me tell you, those famous queens, they were the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority of women, life was confined to the walls of their homes. From the moment a girl was born, society had already written her story. She was the keeper of the house, they'd say. Sounds nice, doesn't it? But what that really meant was that the outside world, those golden sands beyond her doorstep, the marketplace, the temples where real power resided, the halls where decisions were made, those places weren't for her. Her kingdom was the kitchen, the loom, the courtyard. That was it. 4 walls and a lifetime of limitations. And the really heartbreaking part? This wasn't something that gradually happened to women as they grew up. No, this was drilled into them from childhood. Little girls would watch their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers, all living within these same invisible walls. The family laws, the social customs, they all worked together like this intricate trap, binding women's feet before they even learned to walk toward freedom. It was systematic, it was intentional, and it was so normalized that most people never even questioned it. Now, there was a hierarchy among women, of course. If you were born into the royal court, if you were a noblewoman, you might have had a slightly different experience. You might have had servants to do the grinding and washing. You might have worn finer linen, more elaborate jewelry. But you know what? You were still trapped. Different cage, same bars. Maybe your cage was decorated with gold and precious stones. Maybe you had silk cushions and perfumed oils. But a cage is still a cage, isn't it? The gilding doesn't change the fundamental nature of imprisonment. Think about it this way. A peasant woman might spend her day grinding grain, but at least she might walk to the river, see the sky, feel the sun on her face, interact with other women at the water's edge. A noblewoman in the palace, she might never leave those perfumed chambers. Her world was even smaller in some ways. Smaller, but with better food. That's not much of a consolation when you think about it. You're still trapped. You're still controlled. You're still denied the basic freedom to make choices about your own life. The really cruel irony here is that Egyptian society loved to talk about ma'at, about balance and order and justice. They carved it into their temples. They wrote it in their texts. They built their entire worldview around this concept. But that balance? It only applied to men. Women were expected to maintain ma'at by staying in their place, by being obedient, by never questioning the order of things. Their role in this grand cosmic balance was to be silent, to be invisible, to be less, always less, never equal. I often wonder what it must have felt like for a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, to realize that the world she saw from her doorway, that vast world of possibilities, would never be hers. That her brother could dream of becoming a scribe, a priest, a warrior, an architect, maybe even a vizier. But her dreams had to fit within 4 walls. The saddest part? Most of these girls never even thought to question it. This was just the way things were, the way things had always been, the way the gods intended it to be. How do you rebel against something that's presented as divine will? You know, when archaeologists dig up ancient Egyptian homes, they find these really interesting things. They find grinding stones worn smooth by thousands of hours of use. They find loom weights, spindles, cooking pots, all concentrated in specific areas. And what's striking is how these items are always found in the same part of the house, in the women's quarters, in the domestic spaces. It's like the physical evidence itself is telling us. This is where women lived. This is where they worked. This is where they spent their entire lives. The walls of these houses, they weren't just physical barriers. They were the boundaries of an entire existence. They defined the limits of possibility. And here's something that really struck me when I was researching this. Egyptian art and hieroglyphs almost always show men in active poses, doing things, going places, making decisions, interacting with the world. But women? They're usually shown sitting, weaving, or standing behind their husbands. Even in their art, even in how they chose to remember themselves, this inequality was baked right in. It's like society was saying, even in eternity, even in the afterlife, even when we're all just images on a wall, women should know their place. Women should be in the background. Women should be passive. The freedom that women had, if you can even call it freedom, was limited to the household. She could manage the servants if she had any. She could organize the food stores. She could make decisions about the children's daily care, about what to prepare for dinner, about when to do the laundry. But anything beyond those walls, anything that mattered in the larger world, that required a man's permission, a man's presence, a man's authority. It's exhausting just thinking about it, isn't it? Living your entire life needing permission, needing approval, needing someone else to validate your every move beyond your doorstep. And the thing is, this system was so deeply entrenched that it became invisible. It wasn't seen as oppression because it was just normal. It was the natural order of things. The gods had created men to lead and women to follow. The gods had created men to be active and women to be passive. The gods had created men to be free and women to be, well, not free. And who could argue with the gods? Who could question something that had been ordained by the divine? That's the genius of this kind of oppression, really. When you make it sacred, when you make it religious, when you tie it to the cosmic order of the universe, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. I think about these women sometimes, you know, in the quiet moments. I think about a mother teaching her daughter to grind grain, knowing that this skill, this endless, back-breaking labor, is what her daughter's life will consist of. I think about the moment when that realization hits, When a young girl understands that her life will be exactly like her mother's, and her mother's mother, going back generations. The same walls, the same work, the same limitations. There's something profoundly sad about that kind of inheritance, isn't it? When what you pass down to your children isn't opportunity, but constraint. Not possibility, but limitation. Not freedom, but shadows. Just shadows over golden sands that stretch into infinity, but remain forever out of reach. Now, let's talk about love. Or rather, let's talk about what passed for love in ancient Egypt. Because when we think about marriage today, we think about choice, about finding someone you connect with, about partnership, about building a life together based on mutual affection and respect. But in ancient Egypt, marriage was business, pure and simple. It was a transaction, a contract, a political arrangement. And the person most affected by this arrangement, the young woman herself, had absolutely no say in the matter. Imagine being 12, maybe 13 years old. Sometimes even younger, if we're being honest. You're still a child, really. You're still playing with your friends, still learning about the world, still figuring out who you are, what you like, what you dream about. And then one day, your father sits you down and tells you that you're getting married. Not, would you like to marry? Not, I've found someone I think you might like. Not, let's discuss your future. Just, you're getting married. End of discussion. The arrangements have been made. The bride price has been negotiated. Your future has been decided. Pack your things. And here's the thing that really gets me. You had no say in who this person would be. Your father had already chosen. Maybe it was the son of his business partner. Maybe it was someone from a family he wanted to create an alliance with. Maybe it was a distant relative he wanted to keep property within the family. Maybe it was just someone who offered a good bride price, someone who could pay well for the privilege of marrying you. But your feelings, your hopes, your dreams about who you might want to spend your life with, those didn't matter. They didn't even enter the equation. This was about family strategy, about economics, about politics, not about you. Think about what that means for a moment. You're a young girl, and you're told you're going to spend the rest of your life with someone you've maybe never even met. Or maybe you've seen him once or twice at a festival or market. You're going to share a bed with this stranger, bear his children, run his household, grow old with him. You're going to wake up next to him every morning for the rest of your life, and you have absolutely no choice in the matter. It's one of the most important decisions in your life, perhaps the most important decision, and you have zero control over it. Zero input, zero power. The marriage ceremony itself was interesting, if you can call it that. It wasn't like today, where there's this big romantic celebration about love and commitment and two people choosing each other. No, it was a transaction, a formal exchange of property. Because let's be clear about what was happening here. You were being transferred from your father's ownership to your husband's ownership. The ceremony was just making it official, just documenting the transfer of one human being from one man's control to another man's control. There was usually a feast, of course. Egyptians loved a good feast. There would be food, beer, bread, maybe some roasted meat if the family could afford it. There would be music and dancing. Your family would celebrate. Your new husband's family would celebrate. Everyone would be happy about this wonderful alliance between families, this strengthening of social bonds, this smart economic move. Everyone except maybe you. But your feelings? Well, those weren't really the point, were they? You were supposed to smile and look grateful and play your part in this theater of family politics. The bride price is something that really bothers me when I think about it. Your father would receive payment for you. Gold, land, livestock, grain, whatever had been negotiated. And I know, anthropologists will tell you that the bride price wasn't technically buying the woman, that it was more complicated than that it had cultural significance, that it was about compensating the family for the loss of a daughter's labor. But let's be real here. Money was exchanging hands for a human being. A young girl was being valued in terms of how many cows or how much grain she was worth. How is that not buying and selling? How is that not treating a human being as property? And here's what happened after the wedding. You lost your identity. You weren't really your own person anymore. You were somebody's wife, somebody's daughter-in-law, eventually somebody's mother. But who were you as an individual? That question didn't really have an answer. Your identity was always in relation to the men in your life, your father, your husband, eventually your sons. You existed in connection to them, defined by them, not as yourself. Your name might even change. Your old life, your childhood home, your childhood identity, all of that was supposed to be left behind. You were starting fresh, starting new, in a role that someone else had defined for you. I came across this really sad detail in my research. Many marriage contracts from ancient Egypt that have survived, they talk about the woman's duties, the woman's behavior, what the woman must do to be a good wife. Pages and pages of expectations. She had to be faithful, had to be obedient, had to manage the household properly, had to produce children, had to respect her husband's family, had to maintain the home, had to be sexually available, had to. But the man's obligations? Those are much vaguer, much less defined. He had to provide for her, basically. That was about it. Maybe not beat her too severely. Maybe treat her with some basic level of respect. But it was all very vague. The inequality was written right into the contract. It was legal. It was official. It was how things were done. And you know what's really heartbreaking? Some of these marriages happened between girls and much older men. A 12-year-old girl married to a man in his 30s or 40s, sometimes even older. Today, we'd call that exactly what it is. We'd recognize it as the abuse it is. But back then, it was just normal. It was acceptable. It was how you created alliances, how you built family networks, how you secured your family's future. The girl's childhood, her innocence, her youth, her right to grow up before taking on adult responsibilities. Those were all acceptable sacrifices for the family's political and economic goals. The worst part, I think, is that these young girls were raised to accept this. They were taught from childhood that this was their destiny, their purpose. They watched their older sisters go through it. They watched their mothers accept it. They were trained, essentially, to surrender their will, to give up on the idea that they could choose their own path. By the time the marriage actually happened, most of them had already been conditioned to accept it without question. The rebellion had been trained out of them before they were old enough to even think about rebelling. Can you imagine that? Being raised with the knowledge that at some point, probably around your 12th or 13th birthday, you'd be married off to someone chosen by your father. Someone you might not know. Someone you might not like. Someone who might be cruel or kind, gentle or harsh. And you'd just have to accept whatever fate dealt you. There was no escape, no alternative, no other option. Marriage wasn't a choice you made. It was something that happened to you, and you just had to survive it as best you could. I read about one particular case, documented in some papyrus records from the New Kingdom period. A girl, probably about 14, was married to a man twice her age. The records mention that she cried during the ceremony. Just that one line, "The bride wept." And then nothing more about her feelings, her experience, her life after that. She was just another transaction completed, another alliance secured. Her tears were noted, but not important. They were just expected, maybe, or ignored. Either way, they didn't change anything. The marriage went forward. Her life was sealed, and her tears dried eventually, as tears always do, and she learned to live with the choice that had been made for her. So you're married now. You're in your new husband's house, in this new life that was chosen for you. You're trying to adjust, trying to figure out how to navigate this new world, this new family, this new role. And almost immediately, the pressure begins. Because you see, your value as a wife, your worth as a woman, your entire reason for existing in your husband's home, it all came down to one thing. Could you give him sons? Not children. Sons. That's an important distinction. Daughters were fine, I suppose, but they weren't what really mattered. Sons were what continued the family line. Sons were what would inherit the property, carry on the family name, maintain the family's social position. Sons were what would perform the funerary rites to ensure your husband's eternal life in the afterlife. Sons were everything. And if you couldn't produce them, well, that was a problem. A big problem. Possibly a life-destroying problem. The pressure must have been absolutely crushing. Imagine being 14, 15 years old, barely more than a child yourself, and the entire household is watching, waiting, counting the months to see if you're pregnant yet. Your husband is watching, because his status, his legacy, depends on you giving him sons. Your husband's family is watching, because they want to ensure the family line continues. Your own family is watching, because your success reflects on them. The neighbors are watching, gossiping, speculating. Everyone has an opinion about whether you're doing your duty, whether you're fulfilling your purpose. And if month after month goes by with no pregnancy, the whispers start. The blame starts. And guess who gets blamed? Not your husband. Never your husband. It was always the woman's fault. Always. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely desperate. Egyptian women, they tried everything to get pregnant. Everything. They used what they called magic spells, which were basically prayers and incantations to various gods and goddesses. They used herbal remedies, some of which might have actually helped with fertility, but many of which probably did nothing or possibly made things worse. They wore amulets and charms around their necks or waists. They performed elaborate rituals. They visited temples and made offerings to the gods. They consulted with wise women and priests. Anything, everything, just to conceive a child. Preferably a son. Please, gods, let it be a son. The goddess Taweret was particularly important here. She was this deity depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus, standing upright on her hind legs. Which sounds strange, I know, but she was the protector of pregnant women and childbirth, the guardian of mothers and babies. Women would pray to her desperately, would have little figurines of her in their homes, would invoke her name during pregnancy and labor. She was their hope, their protection, their lifeline in a process that was, let's be honest, absolutely terrifying. Because childbirth in ancient Egypt, it was incredibly dangerous. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors who understood anatomy and infection and all the myriad things that can go wrong when you're trying to bring a new life into the world. There were midwives, sure, and some of them were probably quite skilled, with knowledge passed down through generations. But they were working with limited knowledge and primitive tools. They did their best, and sometimes their best was enough. But often it wasn't. Often things went horribly, fatally wrong. Women died in childbirth all the time. All the time. Young women, healthy women, women who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. Women giving birth to their first child, or their fifth, or their 10th. It didn't matter. Infection, hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, eclampsia, all manner of complications we can't even identify from the skeletal remains. They all took their toll. And the babies, many of them didn't survive either. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Some estimates suggest that nearly half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Half. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine living in a world where having a child meant a coin flip whether they'd survive to adulthood? So imagine this. You're a young woman, maybe 16 years old, and you're pregnant for the first time. You should be excited, right? You're finally fulfilling your purpose, doing what you were born to do, meeting everyone's expectations. But instead, you're terrified, because you've watched women die from this. You've seen your neighbors, your cousins, maybe even your own mother or sisters, die giving birth. You've heard the screams of women in labor that went on for days. You know the risks. You know that there's a very real chance you might not survive this. That in trying to give life, you might lose your own. And the pain. Oh, the pain. There was no epidural, no spinal block, no pain medication beyond maybe some beer or wine to dull the edges, to make it slightly more bearable. Women gave birth in a squatting position, supported by birthing bricks or a birthing stool, sometimes held up by other women who would support them through the ordeal. They screamed, they bled, they suffered through hours or sometimes days of labor. Days. Imagine being in excruciating pain for days, feeling your body tearing itself apart, not knowing if you or your baby would survive. And they did it knowing that their pain, their suffering, their risk, it was all expected. It was their duty, their obligation. This is what women were for, after all. The really cruel part is that even after surviving childbirth, even after going through all that pain and risk and trauma, if you had a daughter, there was disappointment, not celebration, not joy that you and the baby survived. Disappointment. Because you hadn't given your husband a son, you'd have to try again. You'd have to go through it all again, and again, and again, until you finally produced a son, or until your body gave out, or until you died trying. I read about one woman in the archaeological records. Her skeleton was found in a tomb from the Middle Kingdom period. She died at age 19. They could tell from her pelvis that she'd given birth at least twice, possibly 3 times. Multiple births before age 19. And the last one killed her. Her baby died too, still inside her, unable to be delivered. They were buried together, mother and child, both victims of a system that valued sons above the lives of the women who bore them. She was 19 years old, and her entire adult life, all 5 or 6 years of it, had been about pregnancy and childbirth. That was her life. That was her story. And then it was over. Some women tried everything to ensure they'd have sons. There were these ancient pregnancy tests and gender prediction methods. Women would urinate on wheat and barley seeds. If the wheat grew, it was supposedly a boy. If the barley grew, a girl. If neither grew, you weren't pregnant. Now, we know this doesn't actually work. It's not based on any real science. But desperate women believed it. They needed to believe in something. Some way to control this uncontrollable process. Some way to influence the outcome. And here's the thing that really gets me. Women blamed themselves. When they couldn't get pregnant, they thought it was their fault, their failure, their inadequacy. When they miscarried, and many did repeatedly, they thought they'd done something wrong, angered the gods somehow. When they had daughters instead of sons, they felt like they'd failed their husbands, failed their families, failed their entire purpose for existing. The society had convinced them that their bodies, their fertility, their ability to produce male children, these were their responsibility alone. And when things went wrong, as they so often did, the shame and guilt fell entirely on them. There's this ancient Egyptian prayer that survived, written on a piece of pottery, written by a woman begging the goddess Hathor for a son. She promises offerings, she promises devotion, she promises to serve the goddess faithfully, if only she'll grant this one request. The desperation in those words, even translated and thousands of years old, it's heartbreaking. This wasn't just about wanting a child. This was about survival. Because a woman who couldn't produce sons, her position in the household was precarious at best, life-threatening at worst. Her husband might take another wife, a younger wife who could give him sons. She might be divorced, sent back to her father's house in shame, if her father would even take her back. Her entire life, her security, her future, all of it depended on her womb's ability to produce male children. What a terrible burden to carry. Let's talk about a typical day in the life of an ancient Egyptian woman. Because while the burden of childbearing was enormous, it wasn't the only thing filling her days. Not even close. The work was endless. Absolutely endless. From before sunrise to long after sunset, there was always something that needed to be done. Always another task waiting. Always more labor to be performed. She'd wake up before dawn, before the sun rose over the Nile and painted the sky in those beautiful colors. Had to, really, because there was so much to do and the day was never long enough. First thing, grinding grain. And let me tell you, this wasn't like opening a bag of flour from the store. No, this was taking whole grains of barley or emmer wheat and grinding them by hand using a stone quern. A saddle quern, they called it. You'd kneel on the ground, take a heavy stone in your hands and grind, 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 pushing the stone back and forth across the grain. Back and forth, for hours. Hours. Your knees would ache from kneeling on the hard ground. Your shoulders would burn from the repetitive motion. Your hands would develop calluses and blisters that would crack and bleed. And you know what archaeologists have found when they study the skeletons of ancient Egyptian women? Severe arthritis in the knees and shoulders, starting at remarkably young ages. Bone damage from repetitive stress. Spinal problems from the grinding position. Dental problems from flour contaminated with sand and grit from the grinding stones, wearing down their teeth until they were ground to nubs by middle age. The work literally wore their bodies down, ground them down physically, just like they were grinding that grain day after day, year after year. Their skeletons tell a story of pain, of hard labor, of bodies destroyed by endless work that was never acknowledged, never valued, never seen as the brutal physical toll it actually was. After grinding the grain, and we're talking about grinding enough grain for the entire family for the day, you'd make bread. Now, bread was the staple food in ancient Egypt, the foundation of every meal. So this wasn't an occasional thing. This was daily, every single day. You'd mix the flour with water, maybe add some dates or honey if your family could afford it, or some herbs for flavor. You'd form the loaves and bake them in a clay oven, and in the Egyptian heat, which could reach well over 100 degrees, standing over that hot oven, feeding it fuel, tending it for hours, it must have been absolutely brutal. The heat, the smoke, the constant attention required. And if you messed up, if you burned the bread or didn't make enough, everyone would know. Everyone would blame you. But you're not done. Oh no, you're not even close to done with the day's tasks. Because someone also had to brew the beer. Yes, beer was a staple beverage in ancient Egypt, drunk by everyone, including children, because it was often safer than water, which could carry diseases. So you'd take some of that grain you'd spent hours grinding, mix it with water and dates, let it ferment in big clay jars. It was a whole process, requiring knowledge and skill and constant monitoring. And it was one more thing on the endless list of tasks that fell to women. Then there was the laundry. Can you imagine doing laundry for an entire family without a washing machine, without running water, without soap as we know it? You'd have to gather up all the dirty clothes, and in a hot, dusty climate, everything got dirty quickly. You'd have to take all of it down to the Nile, to the river's edge, and you'd kneel there in the mud, with the crocodiles nearby in the water. Let's not forget the crocodiles, because they were a very real danger. And you'd beat the clothes against the rocks, scrub them with natron, which is a naturally occurring salt that worked sort of like soap, wring them out. Your hands would be raw and cracked from the work and the natron. Your back would ache from bending over for hours. And you'd do this while constantly watching for those crocodiles, the hippos, any of the dangers that lurked in and around the Nile. It was exhausting, it was dangerous, and it was expected. Just part of being a woman. And we haven't even talked about childcare yet. If you had children, and most women did, multiple children, you were responsible for them. All day, every moment. Feeding them, cleaning them, teaching them, keeping them safe, keeping them alive. The little ones couldn't be left alone because there were too many dangers. Scorpions in the house, snakes in the courtyard, the river if you lived close to it, diseases that could kill a child in days. You had to watch them constantly. And while you're watching them, while you're holding a baby or chasing after a toddler or teaching a child, you're still supposed to be grinding grain, making bread, brewing beer, doing laundry, spinning flax, weaving cloth, cooking meals, maintaining the house, tending the garden if you had one. Oh, right, the spinning and weaving. Because someone had to make the cloth for the family's clothes, for the household linens, the everything fabric. And in ancient Egypt, they primarily used linen, which comes from flax. You'd have to process the flax first, which was its own labor-intensive process. Then you'd spin the flax fibers into thread, which required a drop spindle and hours upon hours of careful, tedious work. Your fingers would cramp. Your eyes would strain from focusing on the fine threads, trying to keep them even and strong. And then, once you finally had enough thread, after weeks or months of spinning, you'd have to weave it into cloth on a loom. More hours, more days, more weeks of labor. More work that no one would ever really see or appreciate because it was just expected. This is what women did. This is what women were for. Some women did this work by the light of oil lamps at night, after everything else was done, after the children were asleep, after the evening meal was prepared and served and cleaned up. They'd sit there in the dim, flickering light, spinning thread, weaving cloth, their eyes burning, their fingers cramping, their backs aching, just trying to get everything done that needed to be done. And the next day, they'd wake up before dawn and do it all again. And the day after that, and the day after that. No weekends, no vacations, no retirement, just work. Endless work, until your body gave out or you died. There was also caring for elderly relatives. In Egyptian culture, the elderly were respected and cared for by their families, which sounds nice and honorable, until you realize it meant more work for the women. More people to cook for, to clean for, to care for, to tend to. If your husband's parents lived with you, and they often did because that was expected, you were responsible for them. Their needs, their comfort, their care, their demands, all of it fell to you. If they were ill, you nursed them. If they were infirm, you helped them with basic tasks. If they were difficult or demanding, you endured it with patience and grace, because to do otherwise would bring shame on the household. And here's the thing. This work was never acknowledged as work. It was just what women did. It wasn't valued, it wasn't compensated, it wasn't even really seen. A man who worked in the fields, or as a craftsman or a scribe, his work was recognized, was valued, had status. He could point to what he'd accomplished. But a woman's work, it was invisible. It was expected. It was endless, back-breaking, body-destroying labor. But because it happened in the home, because it was women's work, it didn't count. It wasn't real work, it was just what women were supposed to do. I think about the fatigue these women must have felt. Not just physical exhaustion, though that must have been constant and overwhelming, a bone-deep tiredness that never went away. But the mental exhaustion, the emotional exhaustion of knowing that tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. That this was your life, and it would never change. There would never be a promotion, a raise, a recognition of your efforts. There would never be a day off, never a vacation, never a retirement where you could rest. Just work, endless work, grinding you down slowly but surely until your body gave out or you died. That's a special kind of exhaustion, isn't it? When there's no hope that things will get better, when there's no end in sight, when you know with absolute certainty that this is your life until death finally releases you. Just endless labor disappearing into the sand, like footprints washed away by the Nile. Now, let's talk about something that might seem superficial at first, but really isn't superficial at all when you think about it. Beauty and appearance in ancient Egypt. Because for women, how they looked wasn't just about personal preference or vanity. It was political. It was social survival. It was power in a world where women had almost no power. It was complicated, contradictory, and often exhausting in its own right. Egyptian women were expected to maintain certain standards of beauty and grooming. And I'm not just talking about occasionally fixing your hair or putting on a nice dress. This was elaborate, time-consuming, and often uncomfortable. One of the most iconic aspects of Egyptian beauty was kohl, that dramatic black eyeliner that we see in all the artwork, in all the painted tomb walls and statues. Women, and men too actually, would line their eyes with this dark cosmetic made from galena, a lead-based mineral ground into powder. They'd use a small stick to apply it, creating those distinctive elongated eye shapes we associate with ancient Egypt. those dramatic lines extending beyond the outer corners of the eyes. Now, on one level, this served a practical purpose. The coal helped reduce glare from the harsh desert sun, which was a real concern. It also supposedly had antimicrobial properties that helped prevent eye infections, which were common in the dusty, sandy environment. But it was also absolutely required from a social standpoint. A woman who didn't wear coal, who didn't maintain her appearance properly, she was seen as slovenly, as not respecting herself or her household, as letting herself go. So, even after spending your entire day grinding grain and doing laundry and caring for children and all the other endless tasks, you still had to make sure you looked presentable. You still had to take the time to apply your makeup, to present yourself properly. Hair was another big thing, another area where women were judged and had to meet certain standards. Egyptian women often shaved their heads and wore wigs. Yes, wigs. Elaborate wigs made from human hair, sometimes mixed with plant fibers or sheep's wool, styled in various ways depending on fashion and status. Why? Well, partly for hygiene. Lice were a constant problem in ancient Egypt, a plague, really, and shaving your head made it easier to deal with them, easier to stay clean. But also because a good wig was a status symbol. It showed that your family had wealth, that you could afford this luxury item, that you had the time and resources to maintain your appearance properly. But here's the thing about those wigs. They were heavy. They were hot. Imagine wearing a thick wig in the Egyptian desert heat when temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Your scalp would sweat. The wig would become damp and uncomfortable. Your neck would ache from the weight, especially the more elaborate wigs that noble women wore. But you wore it anyway, because appearance mattered, because how you looked reflected on your husband's status, on your family's position in society. You weren't just representing yourself, you were representing your family, your household, your husband's success. Your body, your appearance, they weren't your own. They were displays of family wealth and status. Jewelry was the same way, another burden masquerading as adornment. Women wore necklaces, bracelets, anklets, earrings, sometimes elaborate headdresses. The wealthier your family, the more elaborate the jewelry, the more pieces you wore. Gold, precious stones, intricate designs that showcased the craftsman's skill and the family's wealth. And yes, it was beautiful, but it was also heavy. Those broad collar necklaces that we see in Egyptian art, those elaborate pieces that covered the chest and shoulders, they could weigh several pounds. Try wearing several pounds of metal around your neck all day, every day, and see how your shoulders feel by evening. See how your neck aches, how your posture suffers. Women also used various oils and perfumes on their skin, another time-consuming part of the beauty routine. Partly this was for protection against the harsh sun and dry climate, which could leave skin cracked and damaged. But it was also about smell, about controlling the inevitable reality of body odor in a time before modern sanitation and deodorant. When you're working hard in desert heat, grinding grain and baking bread and doing laundry, you sweat. And in ancient Egypt, bathing wasn't a daily occurrence for most people. Water was precious, had to be fetched from the river or a well. So women would use scented oils, myrrh, frankincense, various flower essences, anything to smell pleasant, to mask the smell of sweat and labor. The wealthy had more options, more variety, exotic scents imported from distant lands. The poor made do with what they could afford or make themselves, simpler oils and herbs. But here's where it gets really interesting. Beauty could be a form of power. It was one of the few forms of power available to women in a society that denied them almost every other kind of power. If you were beautiful, if you knew how to use your appearance effectively, you might be able to influence your husband. You might attract the attention of someone powerful who could improve your situation. For women in the palace, for concubines and lesser wives, beauty was their weapon. It was how they competed for favor, for position, for resources, for the chance to improve their circumstances or ensure their children's future. This created this strange, toxic dynamic where women were in constant competition with each other. In households where a man had multiple wives, which was common for wealthier men, the wives would compete for his attention, his favor, his resources. And one of the primary ways they competed was through appearance. Who was more beautiful? Who dressed better? Who wore finer jewelry? Who could maintain their looks longer? It was this exhausting, never-ending competition that pitted women against each other instead of allowing them to support one another. For women in the royal court, this competition could be brutal, even deadly. There are records of palace intrigue involving beauty rituals that went very wrong, deliberately wrong. Women accused of using magic spells or potions to make themselves more beautiful or to make rival women less attractive. Women poisoned through cosmetics laced with harmful substances. Women scarred or disfigured by jealous rivals who saw them as threats. Beauty wasn't just vanity, it was survival, and that made it dangerous. That made it a battlefield. And you know what the really sad part is? Even if you were beautiful, even if you won that competition for attention and favor, even if you became your husband's favorite wife or caught the eye of someone powerful, it was temporary. You aged. Everyone ages. Skin wrinkles, hair grays, bodies change. And in a society that valued youth and beauty in women above almost everything else, aging meant losing power, losing relevance, becoming invisible. A young wife, a young concubine, she could always be brought in to replace you. Your beauty, the one form of power you had, it was on a timer, and everyone knew it. You knew it. I came across this really poignant piece of evidence in my research. A small pottery shard, an ostrakon, with a woman's writing on it. She was describing a recipe for a wrinkle cream, something to make her look younger, listing various ingredients and how to prepare them. And at the end, she'd written something like, "May this preserve my husband's affection," or "May this keep his eyes upon me." Just that one line. It tells you everything about what these women were dealing with. Their worth was tied to their appearance. Their security was tied to their husband's continued attraction to them, to his favor. And they all knew with crushing certainty, that time was not on their side. That eventually, inevitably, they would lose this battle. So yes, when we look at ancient Egyptian art today, we see these beautiful women with their kohl-lined eyes and elaborate wigs and gold jewelry, and we think, oh, how glamorous, how sophisticated, how beautiful. But for the women living it, beauty was work. Beauty was pressure. Beauty was a burden they had to carry while also carrying all those other burdens we've talked about. And beauty was a weapon in a war they didn't choose to fight, but had to fight anyway, because their survival depended on it. That's not glamorous. That's not empowering. That's exhausting. That's sad. That's another way these women were trapped. Another cage made of different bars, but a cage nonetheless. A golden cage, perhaps, but still a cage. Now, let's talk about the legal system in ancient Egypt and how it treated women, because this is where things get really interesting, in a frustrating, infuriating kind of way. See, historians will often tell you that Egyptian women had remarkable rights for their time, that they were better off than women in many other ancient civilizations. And compared to some other ancient societies, that's technically true. Egyptian women could own property, they could initiate divorce, they could inherit wealth, they could engage in business transactions, they could appear in court. On papyrus, in the written law codes, these rights existed. But here's what they don't always mention, what the textbooks often gloss over. Exercising those rights was a completely different story. Yes, a woman could theoretically own land, but in practice, her male relatives, her father, her husband, her sons, her brothers, they controlled it. They made the decisions about it. They profited from it. The woman might have had legal ownership on paper, but actual control? That was another matter entirely. The gap between theory and practice was enormous. Let me give you an example to make this concrete. Say you're a widow and you've inherited your late husband's land. On paper, in the legal documents, it's yours. Your name is on the title. But you need to farm that land, right? You need to hire workers, negotiate with neighbors, possibly defend your property boundaries, deal with irrigation rights, pay taxes. And as a woman doing all of that yourself, society didn't accept it. You'd be pressured, subtly or not so subtly, to have a male relative handle it. Your brother, your adult son, if you had one, maybe even your late husband's brother. And once they were handling it, well, they were really controlling it, weren't they? Your ownership became theoretical. Their control was practical. And there wasn't much you could do about it without causing family conflict and social scandal. Divorce is another interesting case, another place where theory and practice diverged dramatically. Yes, women could initiate divorce. They could leave their husbands. The law allowed it. But the consequences for doing so were severe, often devastating. If you divorced your husband, you might lose access to your children. You might lose your economic support, any property or resources you'd brought to the marriage. You'd face social stigma, intense judgment. People would assume you were the problem, that you'd failed as a wife, that something must be seriously wrong with you. Even if your husband was abusive, even if he was unfaithful, even if he'd abandoned his responsibilities, somehow the divorced woman was the one who'd carry the shame, the one who'd be whispered about, the one who'd be blamed. And if you were divorced by your husband, it was even worse, catastrophically worse. Because then, everyone knew you'd been rejected. You'd failed so completely as a wife that your husband didn't want you anymore. You'd go back to your father's house if you could, if he'd take you back, which wasn't guaranteed. You'd become a burden on your birth family, a failed woman who couldn't maintain a marriage. Or you'd try to survive on your own, which was nearly impossible for a woman in that society. You'd face poverty, social exclusion, maybe even starvation. Very few options were available to a divorced woman, and none of them were good. The laws around adultery are particularly revealing, particularly stark in showing the double standard. If a man had an affair, if he slept with another woman, the penalties were relatively minor. Maybe a fine if it caused major scandal, maybe some social disapproval if he was too blatant about it. But mostly it was tolerated, even expected. Men were understood to have needs, to have desires, and society made allowances for that. But if a woman was unfaithful, if she committed adultery, the punishment could be severe, sometimes horrifically severe. She could be beaten publicly. She could be publicly humiliated, paraded through the streets. In some cases, she could even be killed. The double standard was written right into the law, codified and enforced. Men's sexual freedom was tolerated, even celebrated. Women's sexuality was controlled, restricted, punished harshly. There's this one case I read about in the surviving court documents, papyrus records that somehow survived thousands of years. A woman was accused of adultery by her husband. She denied it completely. There was no real evidence, no witnesses, just his accusation, just his word against hers. But you know what happened? Her testimony was given less weight than his. Because she was a woman. Because women were seen as naturally deceptive, naturally manipulative, naturally dishonest. The court believed the husband, and she was punished. Maybe she was guilty, maybe she wasn't. We'll never know for certain. But the point is, she didn't get a fair hearing. The system was rigged against her from the start. Her voice, her truth, her testimony, they mattered less than his, simply because of her gender. And that's another thing that's really important to understand. Women's testimony in court was generally valued less than men's testimony, across the board, not just in adultery cases. If a legal dispute came down to one woman's word against one man's word, the man was believed. If you needed witnesses for something, having male witnesses was crucial. Female witnesses were fine as supporting evidence, but they weren't enough on their own. They weren't sufficient. The legal system essentially codified the belief that women were less trustworthy, less credible, less reliable, less real than men. Their words carried less weight, their oaths carried less force, their truth carried less conviction. Property disputes, inheritance fights, business dealings, all of these legal matters were stacked against women in practice. Even when the law technically gave them rights, the actual practice of law disadvantaged them at every turn. The judges were men. The scribes recording the proceedings were men. The witnesses given the most weight were men. The lawyers or advocates who could speak for you were men. Women were participating in a legal system that fundamentally didn't see them as equal participants, that didn't value their voices, that didn't believe their truths. And if a woman wanted to bring a legal case, a complaint, a grievance, if she wanted to seek justice for some wrong done to her, she'd better have a very strong case and male relatives willing to support her publicly. Because going to court, standing before those judges, making your case, all of that required confidence, resources, and social capital that most women simply didn't have. The few cases where women successfully fought legal battles and won, those are remembered precisely because they were so rare, so exceptional, so unusual that they stood out. They were noteworthy because they almost never happened. I think about what it must have been like to know that the legal system wouldn't protect you, couldn't protect you, or wouldn't bother to protect you. That if something went wrong, if you were wronged, if you were harmed, if someone took advantage of you, you couldn't count on getting justice. That the laws might say one thing on papyrus in the official codes, but the reality was something else entirely, something much harsher and more unforgiving. It's another way these women were made powerless, another system that kept them trapped, kept them subordinate, kept them voiceless. Another lie about freedom and rights that didn't match the lived reality of their actual lives. The scales of Ma'at, that balance and justice the Egyptians were so proud of, that they built their entire worldview around, those scales were tipped. They were always tipped against women. Heavily tipped. And everyone knew it, even if they pretended they didn't. Even if they talked about how fair and balanced Egyptian society was. The women knew. They knew those scales would never balance for them. That justice was something that happened to other people, to men, but rarely to them. And they had to live with that knowledge, that certainty, every single day. Let's talk about religion now. Because in ancient Egypt, religion wasn't just about personal belief or spiritual practice. It was woven into every aspect of life, every social structure, every law, every custom. Religion was the foundation of society, the justification for the social order, the explanation for why things were the way they were. And for women, religion was complicated. It was a source of hope, yes, but also another system that kept them controlled, kept them limited, kept them in their assigned places. Religion was used to make their oppressions sacred, to make their subordination divine will. Women had roles in religious life, don't get me wrong. They could be dancers in the temples, musicians playing sistrums and harps, singers whose voices would fill the temple courtyards during festivals. These were honored positions, respected roles. During religious festivals and ceremonies, women would perform, would participate actively in the rituals. Their voices, their movements, their presence would be part of the worship. It was probably one of the few times when women were publicly visible, publicly celebrated for their contributions, when they could be seen and heard beyond the walls of their homes. But here's the thing, the crucial limitation. They were never the priests, never the high-ranking religious officials, never the ones interpreting divine will or making important religious decisions, never the ones with real power in the religious hierarchy. Women could perform, could serve, could support the religious infrastructure, but they couldn't lead it, they couldn't shape it, they couldn't define it. That power was reserved exclusively for men. There were priestesses, yes, positions called God's wife or divine adoratress. But these roles were carefully circumscribed, carefully limited. They were usually tied to specific temples, specific cults, and even then, the most powerful religious positions, the ones that influenced policy and politics, were held by men. A woman might be the god's wife of Amun, which sounds impressive, but she was still subordinate to the male high priests, still working within a system designed and controlled by men. And here's where religion really became a tool of control. The gods themselves, or at least how the gods were interpreted and explained by men, reinforced women's subordination. The creation myths, the stories about how the world came to be, they positioned male gods as the primary creative forces. The social order, with men in charge and women subordinate, was presented as divinely ordained, as part of the cosmic order established by the gods at the beginning of time. How do you argue with that? How do you challenge a system where you're told the gods themselves designed it this way? Women were taught that their role, their limited sphere, was sacred. That by being obedient wives and mothers, by staying within their prescribed boundaries, they were honoring the gods, maintaining ma'at, keeping the cosmic balance. Their subordination wasn't oppression, they were told. It was divine duty. It was sacred service. It was their way of contributing to the cosmic order. The chains that bound them were blessed, were holy, were necessary for the proper functioning of the universe. There were goddesses, of course. Isis, Hathor, Bastet, Sekhmet, many others. And women could pray to these goddesses, could seek their help and protection. The goddess Taweret, as we talked about earlier, protected women in childbirth. Hathor was associated with love and beauty and joy. Isis was the devoted wife and mother, the ideal woman. But notice something about these goddesses. Even they were defined largely in relation to male gods, or in terms of traditionally feminine roles. Isis was Osiris's wife, Horus's mother. Hathor was associated with beauty and sexuality. The goddesses, even the powerful ones, even the ones women prayed to desperately, They reinforced traditional gender roles rather than challenging them. The religious rituals themselves often required women to demonstrate their subordination. There were purification rituals, dress codes, behavioral requirements that applied specifically to women. Women had to be ritually pure to participate in certain ceremonies, and maintaining that purity required following strict rules about their bodies, their behavior, their activities. These weren't suggestions, these were religious requirements, and failing to meet them could result in exclusion from religious life, or worse. The concept of the afterlife, which was hugely important in Egyptian religion, even that was gendered. Women could go to the afterlife, could be mummified and buried with grave goods just like men, but their afterlife was often depicted as an extension of their earthly roles. They'd continue to serve their husbands, continue to perform domestic duties, continue to be wives and mothers even in eternity. Even death didn't free them from their assigned roles. Even in paradise, even in the field of reeds where the blessed spent eternity, women were still expected to be subordinate, still expected to serve. I came across this really striking tomb painting from the New Kingdom period. It shows a married couple in the afterlife, and the wife is shown standing behind her husband, smaller than him, in a subordinate position. Even in their eternal rest, even in art meant to represent their ideal eternal existence, she's behind him, lesser than him, subordinate to him. That's what religion taught. That's what religion reinforced. That this hierarchy, this inequality, was eternal, was cosmic, was right and proper and good. And perhaps the cruelest part was this. Religion gave women just enough hope to keep them compliant. Pray to the right goddess, and maybe your childbirth will be safe. Make the right offerings, and maybe your husband will be kind. Follow the right rituals, and maybe, just maybe, your afterlife will be peaceful. Religion offered the possibility of divine intervention, of help from above, of rewards for suffering well. It gave women something to hope for, something to believe in, something to cling to when their earthly lives were hard and painful and limited. But that hope, that belief, it also kept them accepting their situations rather than challenging them. It kept them praying rather than demanding. It kept them hopeful rather than angry. Religion was the ultimate tool of control, because it made resistance seem not just difficult or dangerous, but actually wrong, actually sinful, actually against the cosmic order. You weren't just defying your husband or your father or your society when you tried to step outside your role. You were defying the gods. You were disrupting Ma'at. You were risking not just earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. What woman would risk that? What woman could stand against that kind of pressure? So they prayed. They hoped. They believed. They endured. And they taught their daughters to do the same. That's how religion kept women in chains. Sacred chains that were harder to break than any physical bondage could ever be. Now let's talk about something that might seem glamorous from the outside, but was actually terrifying. Life for women in the royal palace. Because when we think about palace women, we might imagine luxury and comfort and privilege. And yes, those things existed. But we don't often think about the danger, the constant fear, the political machinations that could get you killed. For women in the palace, life was a high-stakes game where one wrong move could mean death. If you were a royal wife, a queen, or a lesser wife, your life was incredibly luxurious in material terms. You'd live in beautiful chambers, decorated with precious things. You'd wear the finest clothes, the most elaborate jewelry. You'd eat the best food, drink the finest wines. You'd have servants to attend to your every need. From the outside, it might look like paradise, but inside those golden walls, it was a battlefield. Because here's the reality. Royal wives were in constant competition with each other. They competed for the king's attention, for his favor, for resources, for influence. But most critically, they competed to have their sons named as the next pharaoh. Because if your son became pharaoh, you'd become the queen mother, one of the most powerful positions in Egypt. You'd have influence, resources, protection for the rest of your life. But if another wife's son was chosen, if you lost that competition, your position became precarious. You might lose your status, your resources, maybe even your life. This competition bred intrigue, conspiracy, and sometimes murder. There are documented cases of palace plots where wives tried to poison the king to put their sons on the throne. Cases where women plotted against each other using poison, magic spells, political manipulation, anything to eliminate rivals. The harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III is a famous example. Several women, including one of the king's wives, plotted to assassinate him and place her son on the throne. The plot was discovered, and everyone involved was executed. Think about what that means. These women lived knowing that any meal might be poisoned, any drink might be contaminated, any servant might be working for a rival, any friend might be a spy. Trust was impossible. Paranoia was survival. You had to watch everyone constantly, suspect everything, protect yourself at all times. That's not luxury. That's living in constant fear. And the competition wasn't just about your own survival. It was about your children's survival, your family's future, your bloodline's continuation. A mother would do almost anything to protect her children, to give them a chance at power and security. And in the palace, almost anything could include terrible things: betrayal, murder, conspiracy. Not because these women were inherently evil, but because the system created a situation where such actions seemed necessary, seemed like the only way to protect what mattered most. There was also the practice of royal incest, of brothers marrying sisters, of pharaohs marrying their own daughters or half-sisters. This was done to keep the bloodline pure, to keep power within the family, to maintain the divine status of the royal family. But imagine being a woman forced into marriage with your brother, or worse, your father, having no choice in the matter, having to accept it as normal, as necessary, as your duty. The psychological toll of that, the trauma of that, it's hard for us to even comprehend. The palace was filled with women, wives, concubines, daughters, sisters, all living in this confined space, all competing for limited resources and attention, all trapped in a golden cage. They might have beautiful things, but they didn't have freedom. They couldn't leave. They couldn't choose their own paths. They were essentially prisoners, albeit luxurious prisoners, in a system that valued them only for their beauty, their fertility, their ability to produce heirs. And the isolation must have been crushing. You're surrounded by hundreds of women, but you can't trust any of them. You can't form real friendships because anyone could be a rival, anyone could betray you, anyone could be plotting against you. You might have family, but even family relationships were complicated by politics and competition. Your sister might be your rival for the king's attention. Your daughter might be married off to secure an alliance. Your son might be in danger from other women's plots. Everyone was simultaneously family and potential enemy. The loneliness of that, the paranoia of that, constant stress of that. I think it probably drove some women mad. There are hints in the historical records of palace women who became unstable, who acted erratically, who had to be confined or controlled. And you know what? I don't blame them. Living like that, in constant danger, with no one to trust, with your children's lives hanging in the balance based on political calculations you could barely understand or control. It would drive anyone to the edge. And here's the really tragic part. These women, the ones in the palace with all their luxury and privilege, they might have actually been worse off in some ways than peasant women. Yes, they had material comfort, but they had less freedom, more danger, more stress, more constant fear. A peasant woman might work herself to exhaustion, but at least she could trust her family, could form real bonds with other women in her village, could live without constant fear of assassination. Palace women had gold chains, but they were still chains. Maybe heavier chains than the invisible ones that bound other women. Now let's talk about something that's harder to document, harder to prove, but absolutely happened. Women's resistance. Because despite everything, despite all the systems designed to keep them subordinate and controlled, some women resisted. Some women fought back in small ways, in hidden ways, in ways that often weren't recorded, but that must have happened. Think about it. Women secretly teaching each other to read. Because literacy was power, and it was largely restricted to men. Scribes were almost exclusively male. But we know that some women could read and write. We found letters written by women, documents signed by women. So somewhere, somehow, girls were learning. Maybe from sympathetic brothers or fathers. Maybe from other women who'd somehow gained literacy. And they kept it quiet, kept it secret. Because being too educated, being too knowledgeable, could be threatening, could be dangerous for a woman. There's this one ostracon, a pottery shard with writing on it, that's always fascinated me. It contains what appears to be practice writing by a woman, someone learning to form hieroglyphs, practicing the same symbols over and over. She was teaching herself, or being taught, despite all the social pressure for women to remain illiterate and uneducated. That pottery shard is evidence of resistance, of a woman refusing to accept her assigned limitations, even in such a small way. Women also must have found ways to influence village decisions, community matters, even though they weren't officially allowed to participate in governance. Through their husbands, through whispered suggestions, through indirect influence. It wasn't the same as having direct power, wasn't the same as being able to vote or speak publicly, but it was something. It was what they had. And some women became skilled at wielding that indirect influence, at shaping decisions without being seen to do so. There were networks of women, informal support systems that we can glimpse in the archaeological evidence. Women who helped each other through childbirth, who shared knowledge about herbs and healing, who supported each other through abuse or hardship. These networks weren't official, weren't documented, but they must have existed. Because how else did women survive? How else did they cope with everything they endured? They had each other, in whatever small ways they could manage. I imagine there were small acts of rebellion in households. A wife who managed the household finances cleverly, skimming a little here and there to build her own small reserve. A mother who taught her daughter to be strong, to think for herself, even while teaching her to appear compliant. Women who found small ways to exert control over their own lives, to carve out tiny spaces of autonomy within the larger system of control. There's evidence of women in the workforce beyond just domestic labor. Women who worked as weavers, as professional mourners, as musicians, as midwives. These were jobs that gave women some economic independence, some identity beyond just wife and mother. And while these jobs were still within acceptable female roles, they were also opportunities for women to have their own money, their own relationships, their own sphere outside the home. That was resistance in its own way, pushing against the boundaries of what women were supposed to be. And there must have been dreams. Women who looked at their daughters and hoped, desperately hoped, that maybe their daughters' lives would be better, that maybe things would change, that maybe the next generation would have more freedom, more choices, more opportunity. Those dreams might seem small, might not seem like resistance, but hope in a hopeless situation is its own form of defiance. Believing that change is possible, that things don't have to stay the same forever, that's the beginning of all resistance. There are also records of women who straight up refused marriages, though these are rare. Women who ran away, who chose disgrace over compliance. Women who divorced their husbands despite the social costs. These women paid dearly for their choices, but they made them anyway. They chose to resist even knowing the consequences. That takes incredible courage. I came across one document, a legal case where a woman refused to return to her husband after he'd been abusive. She stood in front of the court and argued her case, laid out the abuse she'd suffered, and refused to go back despite enormous pressure. We don't know what happened to her eventually, whether she won her case, but the fact that she tried, that she stood up and spoke her truth publicly, that's remarkable. That's resistance. And every woman who taught her daughter to be clever, to be resourceful, to find ways to protect herself, to survive with dignity in an undignified situation, those women were resisting too. They were passing down wisdom, teaching survival skills, preparing the next generation. They couldn't change the system, not directly, not openly, but they could prepare their daughters to navigate it, to survive it, maybe even to subtly undermine it. The smiles that hid pain, the quiet endurance, even those were a form of resistance. Refusing to be broken, refusing to let the system destroy your spirit even as it controlled your body and your choices. That's not acceptance. That's defiance. That's a woman saying, "You can control my circumstances, but you can't control who I am inside. You can cage me, but you can't make me less than I am." Let's talk about death now, about the end of these women's lives. Because in ancient Egypt, death was a huge deal. So much of Egyptian culture was focused on the afterlife, on preparing for death, on ensuring a good eternity. And for women, death might have been the only time they truly had hope for peace, for rest, for freedom from all the burdens they'd carried in life. The funeral preparations were elaborate, especially for those who could afford it. The body would be mummified, a process that took weeks, that required specialized knowledge and expensive materials. The internal organs would be removed and preserved in canopic jars. The body would be dried with natron, wrapped in linen, adorned with amulets and protective symbols. For a woman, this final preparation of her body might have been the last time anyone treated her physical form with such care and attention. The tomb, if the family could afford one, would be filled with grave goods, food for the journey, jewelry, clothes, furniture, everything the deceased might need in the afterlife. For women, these goods often included domestic items, grinding stones, weaving equipment, cosmetics. Even in death, even in preparation for eternity, the assumption was that women would continue their domestic roles, would continue to serve, would continue to be wives and mothers and homemakers. But there was one thing that made death different, one thing that offered hope: the weighing of the heart ceremony. According to Egyptian belief, when you died, You'd stand before Osiris and the gods. Anubis would place your heart on a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at. If your heart was lighter than the feather, if you'd lived a good life, you'd be allowed into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. If not, if your heart was heavy with sin, the demon Ammit would devour it, and you'd cease to exist. And here's the remarkable thing. This judgment wasn't supposed to be gendered. The gods didn't ask if you'd been obedient to your husband. They didn't ask if you'd been a good wife or if you'd produced sons. They asked if you'd been truthful, if you'd been kind, if you'd lived according to Ma'at. In death, at least in theory, women were judged by the same standards as men. In death, they were finally equal. I wonder how many women found comfort in that thought, that after a lifetime of inequality, of subordination, of being treated as less than human, they'd finally stand before the gods as equals, that their worth would finally be judged by who they were, not by their gender or their ability to produce children or their obedience to men. Death offered what life never did, the possibility of true justice, true balance, true Ma'at. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife was beautiful, really. The field of reeds was supposed to be like Egypt, but perfect. No hunger, no thirst, no pain, no suffering. You'd be with your loved ones forever. The crops would always grow, the sun would always shine. It was paradise. And for women who'd spent their lives in hard labor, in pain, in constant stress and fear, that promise of eternal rest must have been incredibly appealing. But there's something sad about that too. That the only hope for peace, the only hope for freedom, the only hope for rest came after death. That women had to wait until they were dead to imagine being free. That eternity was the only time frame in which equality seemed possible. Their lives were hard, were limited, were painful. But at least death offered the hope of something better. The tombs that have survived, the ones we can still visit today, they're covered in paintings and hieroglyphs, scenes of daily life, religious texts, spells and prayers. And among these images are women, depicted alongside their husbands, sometimes with their children. In these paintings, they look peaceful, serene, content. But we have to remember, these are idealized images, propaganda for the afterlife, showing what people hoped for rather than what their lives actually were. When archaeologists study mummies, especially female mummies, they find evidence of hard lives: arthritis, dental problems, signs of multiple pregnancies, sometimes evidence of violence or malnutrition. The bones tell the truth that the tomb paintings hide. These women suffered. Their bodies were worn down by lives of hard labor and limited resources. But their tombs, their final resting places, try to hide that suffering, try to present an idealized version of who they were. I think about the last moments of these women's lives. Did they feel relief? Did they feel fear? Did they look forward to the afterlife, to finally resting, to finally being free? Or did they grieve for the lives they never got to live, the dreams they never got to pursue, the potential they never got to fulfill? And I think about the daughters and granddaughters they left behind, the women who had to continue living in that same system, carrying those same burdens. Each woman's death was an individual tragedy, but the system continued. The oppression continued. The limitations continued. Generation after generation of women living the same restricted lives dying with the same hopes that death might bring the freedom life never did. The last thing I want to leave you with tonight is this. We remember these women through fragments. A pottery charred with writing. A skeleton showing signs of hard labor. A tomb painting showing an idealized scene. A legal document recording a marriage or divorce. These fragments are all we have left of millions of women who lived and loved and suffered and died along the Nile thousands of years ago. They lived in the shadows of the pyramids, in the shadows of history, in the shadows of the men who ruled their world. But they were there. They existed. They mattered. They had dreams and hopes and fears and pain. They had full, complex inner lives that we can only guess at from the evidence they left behind. And maybe, just maybe, some of them found peace in the end. Maybe some of them made it to that field of reeds, to that eternal paradise where they could finally rest, finally be free, finally be valued for who they were, rather than what they could provide to men. That's what I hope for them anyway. That somewhere, somehow, they found the freedom in death that they were denied in life. That the shadows finally lifted and they stepped into light. Good night. And may the women who lived in those shadows over golden sands finally rest in peace.